Special thanks to Affordable Prestige Cars of Glastonbury for providing the Jag in this review, and of course if you've followed the Beards and Cars series for some time you'll recognise their name, especially when it comes to Jags that I've reviewed. So of course if you want to check out their current stock or get in contact with them if you're in the southwest of the UK or maybe even a little bit further afield, you can check out their website via the link right below this video in the description. To say that I've wanted to drive this car and review this car for a long time is a colossal understatement. In fact, along with a certain amount of other vehicles that, funnily enough, I've actually ended up reviewing this year in particular, in Season 3 of Beards and Cars, this was easily in my top 10 vehicles I wanted to drive the most. And the reason why, as some of you will remember if you've been watching this series for long enough, is because of what a massive impression was made on me from driving an XFR. It ended up, spoiler alert, being my car of the year in 2020. That's kind of a big deal given how many other fantastic cars I drove that year. Now the reason why was partially because of how surprising it was to me. It was a car that I had at best measured expectations of, and it blew those expectations out of the water to be everything beautiful and fantastic about an XKR, but more. More space, more doors, more seats, more practicality, more comfort. It just makes sense as a super saloon, and it's a far more, in my opinion, interesting choice and an unexpected one than something like an AMG or an M car. Doesn't mean it's for everyone, but it certainly is for me. Naturally then, why wouldn't I want to drive this? It's the ultimate XF. Now here's the interesting thing though. Those expectations, and now that I'm not surprised by how good an XFR can be, could really work against this car, in a similar way to how they could work against an XKRS, which I've also reviewed. Here's the interesting thing though. The XKRS still fundamentally feels like an XKR. It just feels like one that's turned up to 11, especially when it comes to power. This is not one of those occasions. This car feels so different to the XFR, it may as well have an entirely different name on the back. And for some people, I could actually see that being a disappointment. In fact, even for myself, I'm not entirely sure in the long run where this will end up being on my rank of dream cars, because for quite a while I really wanted an XFRS, and in particular I would love the Sport Brake, the wagon version, which to me has always been a curiosity of why on earth Jaguar would make a wagon version of this, but not the normal XFR. That seems almost like you do it the other way around, surely, but for whatever reason that's what they did, and I'm kind of glad they did because it's a way more interesting choice than something like an Audi RS6, which is just so obvious. Now, in terms of performance, of course it's using the XKRS engine, supercharged 5-litre V8, over 540 horsepower, around 50 or so Newton meters of torque more than the existing XFR, itself already a close to 200 mile an hour car, on the salt flats at least. This one raises the speed limiter to 186 miles an hour, the 0 to 60 time is a very impressive 4.4 seconds, which for what is, let's be honest, essentially a brute force muscle car, is pretty damn good. It doesn't even have all-wheel drive to help it. But the curious thing is how different the handling is, in particular on this car. You'd expect it to be sharper, quicker through corners, more maybe precise, more composed, tighter, tauter. Well, you're not wrong, technically, but the funny thing is, and much of this will doubtless depend on tyre choice, Pirelli, Michelin, whatever brand, it's actually very twitchy compared to the normal XFR. The XFR is a sublimely smooth car. It's easy to predict what it's going to do. It has a nice feeling of weight to it where it's not heavy, but it's got some heft, some chunkiness to it where you can really throw it around, much like an XK can. This does not have that. In fact, this actually feels much closer to a Maserati Quattroporte, in fact, in terms of its steering, or an Alfa Romeo Giulia Quadrifoglio, wherein the front end feels much, much lighter, but also much more precise and much twitchier. The turn-in is much sharper. This car doesn't so much as slide through corners as dive into them. It has much more of a sports car vibe to it, and the drastic improvement in pure performance, track day kind of stuff, is so much more apparent here than it is with an XKR versus an XFR-S. And that's interesting. It's kind of impressive, actually, how much of a change Jaguar made between this and the normal model. It kind of makes me wish they'd have gone for an XFRS GT, like they did with the XK. That could have been an interesting car, but they never did that. In terms of performance, well, as I said, it's ballistically quick. It's not quite as quick as something like some AMGs, perhaps an M5, and certainly not an RS6 off the line, but it's more than quick enough to be, at the very least, a threat to them, and I would say the biggest ace in the hole that this car has is personality. A lot of those German cars, as impressive as they are, honestly, they just bore me after a while. They're like sitting in an office, they're very quick, but there's not that much character to many of them. This has so much character that, don't take offence to this please if you are an owner, it actually reminds me of what you'd expect from an Australian car. See, what I think this car gives off is the vibe of something which Australian petrol heads would absolutely love. I mean, just look at the car. It has so much similarity to something like here in the UK, the Vauxhall VXR8 Bathurst. Of course, over there they'd call it a Holden. It's got such a similar look to it. It's that big four-door muscle shape with a huge supercharged V8. It just ticks all the boxes of what an Aussie would love, except it has the extra badge panache, the prestige, it's more upmarket, it has the nicer interior, etc. And of course, much more of a premium price. Now, speaking to those prices here in the UK, well, if you can even find one, and if you wanted the sport brake like I do, good luck even more so because they're so rare. There's usually maybe 2 or 3 of these for sale at any given time, usually like a white one, a red one, a blue one. In my opinion, incidentally, French Racing Blue is by far the best colour for the car, but they tend to vary between 30 and 40-ish thousand pounds, occasionally higher, but that's the usual region. So, in other words, 3 or 4 times the price of an XFR on the used market. That's kind of a problem. See, it's not a problem to the right buyer. For somebody who wants the ultimate XF, perhaps even the ultimate Jag, you could argue, that's why I put it in the thumbnail, and I'm going to talk about why in just a second for those who maybe think it's a dumb thing to even question. Is it really 3 or 4 times better than an XFR? That's the thing I'm not so sure about, because I already love the XFR for reasons that this one doesn't even attempt to do, and that's why it's a problem answering the question. Comparing this to an XFR is almost moot. They are that different. It feels almost unfair to compare them because they're aiming at completely different things. It's actually quite remarkable how good of a job Jaguar made of making them feel as different as they do. I would imagine Mercedes must have a similar vibe when you compare something like a AMG 63 to a Black Series. Just how different those are kind of is reminiscent to me of this kind of vibe. Now, in terms of who should buy one of these, well, simply put, I think you should buy one of these if you have to have one of these. This isn't a car that you should consider buying. If you're considering maybe possibly looking into buying an XFRS, then honestly it's probably not the car for you. This is an enthusiast's car. It's the kind of car that you buy it because you've always wanted one, which was the case for me. It's the kind of car that you should buy if you can't stand the idea of having an XFR. You've got to have the S because it's the ultimate version. Now, speaking of ultimates, let's get into what I was saying about my opinion potentially making this the ultimate Jag. Why would I even suggest that? How on earth could this be the ultimate Jag? Well, consider this. Take the 4-door version, not even the sport brake, which I'm going to come back to in a second. The 4-door version already has an advantage over literally every sports car Jaguar has ever made in terms of practicality. As lovely as an XKR is, I had one for a while, as fantastic as the F-Type is, certainly plenty to love, as iconic as the XJ220 is, and of course how stunning looking my personal favourite Jaguar design of all time is, the CX-75, which unfortunately wasn't produced. This one has an advantage over all of those. 2 extra doors, more luggage space, and 5 seats, as well as fantastic headroom, legroom, arm room, and everything else room, because it's just a bigger car. It's an executive machine. So in terms of practicality, it more than ticks the box. Then we bring in the sport brake. Even more room, even more space, and probably controversially, in my opinion, it looks even better as well. The wing won't be for everyone, but the wagon does away with the wing, and it looks so good as an estate car in my opinion. The reason why, to go on from the ultimate Jag argument, will now combine all of that space and practicality with the fact that it actually does still ride very well. It's certainly harder, harsher and twitchier than an XFR, but it's still pretty comfortable. Certainly for a 540 horsepower, 186 mile an hour car, it's pretty damn comfortable. The fuel economy can average up around 23-24 to the gallon, which isn't bad at all for that kind of power. In terms of daily use, everything I'm saying means you could certainly use it as a daily driver if you wanted to, a top tier daily driver. But also even the price. Used, it still undercuts some of the iconic rivals it's up against. Try getting like a BMW M5 Touring with that V10 engine. Well, first of all, good luck finding one. Secondly, it's probably going to cost you at least as much for an equivalent mileage car. So even in terms of price, 40 grand, although a lot more than a normal XFR, is still about right really for a car that is as rare as these are. These are some of the ultimate British unicorn cars. They are so rare, even more rare than the XKRS is. Not quite as rare as an XKRS GT, but you get the point. Now, one of the vehicles that I mentioned just now was the XJ220. That's one of the most iconic Jaguar performance cars ever, maybe even the most iconic. This has as much power as that does, and it has more torque. If that doesn't stand for something, then I don't know what is. It's literally a saloon car, an executive saloon technically, with the power of what was literally the fastest car in the world for about 5 minutes, but still the fastest car in the world nonetheless. And unlike an XJ220, this doesn't cost £400,000. It's about 40 on the higher end. Maybe you can start to see what I'm getting at about the whole ultimate Jaguar thing. Are there faster Jags? Absolutely. If you come forward a few years, Jags started to have an all-wheel drive advantage off the line. You start to have stuff like SVRs coming into the range, and of course they're even faster. But there's more to it than just performance. You could make an argument for those maybe being even more so of the ultimate Jag, maybe something like an F-Pace SVR. It's a strong argument to make. But in my opinion, this one preserves the purity of a pure performance car, while being practical as well. So it's not like you can complain about, oh, it's just another big SUV, oh, it's a sports car like an F-Type that isn't practical enough. You can't really level any kind of valid critique at this car because it still looks great. It looks exotic. It's sleek. It's not created on the market just for the sake of the SUV trend. It still has a purity of its design, wherein it is as deserving, at least, to be as legendary as a BMW M5, as an Audi RS6, and as a number of other cars which people unequivocally adore. The XKR is adored that much in the GT world. For whatever reasons, the XFR just hasn't pushed through, and the XFRS, despite being even more extreme, hasn't quite pushed through either. It's a car where if you've driven one, you'll praise it endlessly. Journalists consistently praise the car, and yet so many people seem to either completely forget that it's an option or just haven't even thought to try one out. That honestly is their loss, because I think these are outstanding cars. For my final thoughts on the XFRS, I am definitely glad I finally had the chance to drive one. I will say for me personally, on a completely subjective note, I don't find this car as impressive as an XFR because of two things. One being 3 to 4 times the price. I would say it's maybe twice as good, but not 3 or 4 times as good. That's a big difference. And also because I already knew what to expect, so my expectations were higher. I will freely admit that that definitely has something to do with it. On a more objective note, I do think this is the ultimate Jag. And especially in wagon form, it's probably a vehicle I would suggest to someone who loves Jaguar, wants something that is just an ultimate daily driver. Maybe they even already have a sports car. Maybe you've already got an F-Type or an XK, and you want something that still has that kind of feeling, that charisma, that big cat energy, but you want something that has a bit more space, a bit more, daily driver appeal, but without losing the other side. Well, it's, in my opinion, the pinnacle of that from Jaguar. And for those who maybe don't like the newer lack of purity, let's say, of all-wheel drive, well, it's still rear-wheel drive, and it still has that old-school muscle kind of vibe. This is kind of a pivot point car, as I've talked about with some others in the past. It's right on the cusp of being the ultimate of old-school technology, and where it was just starting to tip into new-school stuff. Kind of the best of the old world, if you will. Overall though, that's it for my thoughts on the XFR-S. It's an absolutely fantastic car, a vehicle which I'm so glad I drove, and of course I would love to hear your thoughts down below. Do you love these cars? Are you maybe more of a fan of the wagon or the saloon? If you've driven one, definitely give me your thoughts on how you felt, and maybe something that you might agree or disagree with about my thoughts. And of course, if you own one, drop your thoughts down below and your experience of ownership to maybe benefit others who are thinking of buying one, either this one or an XFR. And of course, if you haven't watched my review for the XFR, it's here on the channel as well, and probably here on screen right now. But until next time, I'll see you then, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.